G'day, my name's Ed and I'm from Highcal Firearms and Ordnance. I'm a contracted gunsmith for Australian sporting agencies, primarily doing their warranty repair work. They've asked me to talk to you guys about disassembly, reassembly and maintenance of the Verney Carron Veloce. Now I'm going to make a couple of assumptions before we start this video, and I'm going to assume that you know how to take your barrel on and off your shotgun, being that that's how it comes in the kit. So we're not going to cover off on that, but we'll cover off on everything else. So before we go and strip down the main receiver of the gun, we'll talk about the barrel and we'll talk about some care and maintenance items on that barrel. So just move the gun out of the way. Now we're going to start from the muzzle end and we'll work our way back to the chamber end. So on the muzzle end, as you may all be aware, that there is a choke in there. It is a Beretta Benelli choke. That's compatible with most of your Turkish shotguns. A lot of European stuff uses the Beretta Benelli style. So we're just going to rip this choke out using the tool that you get in the kit. So on your chokes, obviously we have a threaded portion at the top here, and then we have the main body of the choke. So you need to make sure that is adequately lubricated. And the reason being is when you fire a shotgun, there is a certain gap between the end of our choke and the counterbore recess in the barrel. Now it's not perfectly fitted, and it never is on any shotgun, and it does allow a certain amount of wadding to go up in there, and you get some carbon from the powder. Now the problem being is if you don't take out your chokes very regularly and clean them, you can have an issue where the choke, because it's so thin, starts to bend inwards, and if it bends inwards enough, the wad will actually grab it. You can force a piece of shot up underneath it and you'll blow the muzzle out of your shotgun. So care and maintenance is highly required on the choke end. When we do take our choke out and we're doing our routine maintenance, we're going to look up inside our muzzle. We're going to be looking at our threads and make sure our threads are in good order. We're going to make sure that all of that has been cleaned out. Now the easiest way to clean that out is either with a 12 gauge brush, or you can even use one of your standard rifle brushes. Get in there, clean all your threads, clean everything out. You can pull through your barrel with the chokes out. So for instance, with a standard mop, and we can, from the chamber end, run that up, and that can clean out up underneath our choke. Now when we go to put our choke back in, as I said, we need it to be adequately lubricated. My personal preference for lubrication on chokes is lithium grease. You can use oil, but the problem with oil is it's more susceptible to heat, and because of its lower viscosity, you can actually, from the pressure of the 12,000 psi pressure you get in a shotgun, can actually blow all the oil straight out of the choke. It gets heated up, it gets blown out, then it gets dry, and that's when you start getting issues. So I typically will stick with lithium grease. But you can use oil, just means you've got to maintain it a little bit more often with the oil. Now with cleaning your chokes, I would advise you to do it every single time you fire your gun. So go out for the day, do your shooting, and then when you pack that gun up to put it back in your safe, I would advise you to take out your chokes, clean them, re-lubricate them and reinstall them. And when you're tightening your chokes, you don't have to get it super tight, you just have to wind it enough that it's snug, and then take the tool out. You don't have to really grind down on it. It may loosen up throughout the day of firing, so in between sessions, if you're walking from stand to stand, or you're having a lunch break or whatever, just double check it. It shouldn't come loose, but if it does, just nip it back up again, and that is all good. Now we'll talk about the finish. The finish on these barrels is parkerized, and the way parkerizing works is it makes the metal kind of porous on the outside, and that's designed to hold oil, and then the oil is your rust inhibitor. So you can tell that this one is completely dry. This is a brand new gun out of the box. But if we were to oil this, we could use any number of oils. Spray oils are okay. If we spray a little bit here, we can see that the color changes completely on that barrel. So that makes it look a million times better. And we can rub that oil in, and we can see there that that is looking a lot better. So if you go firing, you fire a lot of shells, you will dry up that oil, because oil doesn't like heat, and it will go back to its real matte finish, which is fine because it's parkerized. You can just re-oil it, and that's going to help you inhibit some of that rust. If you go shooting it all day and it does go back to its dry looking state and it looks a little bit chalky, which is how parkerizing can go when it's super dry, then you're more susceptible to get rust on your barrels. So the actual finish itself is not what inhibits the rust. like a nitrite coating or a Cerakote or whatever, it does need to hold oil, and the oil is what actually inhibits the rust. So just keep that in mind. You need to keep the outside of your barrels oiled, otherwise they will rust. All right, so this is where the gas is ported off from the bore, and we can see our 2 gas holes here. Now you need to make sure that those are clean. If they get clogged up with, you know, bits of wadding, which can happen, so you might have some plastic in there, you can have carbon residue in there, etc. If they get blocked up, you will have cycling issues with your gun, so it's important just to, you know, just get a little pick or something and just make sure that those are clear. And one thing that people are not really aware of is up in here, there is an O-ring. Now this O-ring is made of a high stress silicon, and it's designed to stop the gases from porting forwards. So if you imagine the gas comes down the bore here, it hits our ports and it directs down into this cylinder. If it's not sealed, you'd have gas porting forwards, which would then mean less gas porting backwards onto your gas piston to cycle the working parts. So that O-ring serves a very good purpose. The drama with the O-ring is they can degrade over time, particularly from using certain types of cleaners. So gun oils are good, but not all oils are created equal. So some oils are just a lubricating oil, and some are multi-purpose oil, like a CLP, cleaning, lubricating, and protecting. Now, the cleaning agents in cleaning oils can degrade the O-ring, so it's just a good idea generally to keep oil away from that component. Now you can easily, it's hard for me to show you on camera, but you can easily look up in there and inspect that O-ring. If it's got you know, gouges out of it, if it's got cracks, that'll be easy to tell. You need to take that O-ring out and, you know, then replace it with a new O-ring. That's a serviceable item. They do get changed out when they do you know, degrade. To take those out is actually fairly simple. You can just use yourself a little pick, and it's going to be very hard for me to show you on camera, but you can get your pick up underneath it and push, and there we have our O-ring. So we can inspect that O-ring, make sure it's all good. Sometimes if it's damaged, and usually it's going to be damaged on the inside edge because that's where your magazine tube threads are going to roll over. If that's damaged, you can actually get a little bit more use out of it by inverting it so now the damaged edge is on the outside, and then put it back in. So to get it back in, I'm just going to push it into its groove, and once again I apologise, that is very hard for you to see. But once you do it for yourself, you'll kind of get the gist. Just push it back into the groove and massage it in, and it'll go back in. Right, so moving back to our chamber end, some things we're going to look for when we're doing our routine maintenance is this groove here is actually where our extractor will ride up into. Now, sometimes the extractor can catch slightly on the edges and can roll over a burr. Now, that's not a big deal, but it is something to bear in mind that if it does, the more it burrs over, the more it's going to grab that extractor. You can have extraction issues from that. So just inspect that to make sure there's no burrs. If you do have a burr and you really want to knock it off, just get yourself a small needle file and or a diamond lap, and you can easily just nick your edges and just take that burr off. Don't go too far, you don't want to remove heaps of material, but you might want to just run those down there, take a burr off if there is one present. That there is our ejector post. So when our bolt retracts, our extractor takes our cartridge with it. The rim of that cartridge is going to hit the ejector post, and it's going to force it to jump out of the ejection port on the gun. So one, this rides in a groove on the left-hand side of the bolt, so you need to make sure that this is not completely burred up, and it can, over time, get damaged. Once again, if it's got a burr on it, take the burr off with a diamond lap or a needle file. It shouldn't get too damaged, and if it gets to a point where it's ridiculously damaged, you may be looking at a new barrel. But as I said, I rarely see that happen. It's just important to keep an eye on it. This is one area where not cleaning your firearm can actually cause you a lot of dramas as well. So this portion here is actually the locking abutment for the locking lug on the bolt. So the bolt has a locking lug on the top of it. And I'll just show you an example. This is not a Veloce bolt. This is out of a different shotgun, but it has the same type of locking bolt. And in the up position, you can see that this ledge is here. Therefore, from that is if you get dirt up in here, and you can get carbon, you can get little filings off the rim of your shells. If you fired enough shells, can get jammed up in here, and then the bolt won't lock correctly. So if the bolt doesn't lock correctly, you will have issues. So it's very important to keep this surface clean. For our chamber itself, we have a little lip here, and that's where the rim of our case sits. Now, you may, as I said before, with the extractor cut, you may get a burr right there, and that burr can roll in. It can actually force your rim to not sit flush in this recess. If it does that, you'll have a very slight decrease in headspace, which can prevent it from locking up correctly because there's a timed distance between here and here. It's not going to be very great, but it can cause you some sluggish issues with chambering, firing and ejecting. So if you're having some sort of issues, you know, that's something you can look at. Just check for burrs up around here. In the chamber, now obviously you're going to clean your chamber like you clean with any other gun. Particularly with shotguns though, because of the amount of friction you get from a plastic hull, the polish on the inside is very important. Over time, chambers can get scratched up from, you know, there being dirt on the shells as they go in. You can get filings from the rims, etc., stuck up in there, and that can cause little minor scratches, and that will cause you more friction, which can cause you chambering and ejecting issues. Make sure you keep it clean. If you do get to the point where, you know, there is a lot of damage up in your chamber, you can actually send it in and we can re-hone your chamber, which will alleviate those issues. So it's not a big deal. But if you don't have the equipment to do it, obviously I wouldn't recommend that you start honing your chambers. There is a specific honing lap for a chamber. So if you are having that issue, you can send it in and that can get fixed. So that's all of the information about our barrel. All right, so let's now move on to our main portion of the gun. As I said earlier, I'm going to make an assumption that you know how to do this part, so I'm not really going to talk through it. We're just going to do it and you can follow along. So you probably know how to do that part. You may know how to do the next part, but we will show you anyway, just to be sure. So to get, and I'm sorry I have to reach around the camera, it's kind of awkward for me. To get our charging handle out, we need to push back on our charging handle slightly, align the groove at the top of the bolt with the hump on the top of the charging handle, and then that will pull straight out. We can then release, and normally it's done up like this, we will release that. So to get this apart, you just rotate that down and it will come off. And then for our bolt, it will just lift off the bolt carrier or action bar, whichever way you want to call it. All right, and then we're going to take our recoil spring off. All right, so we've got that far. Let's talk about these components before we talk about the rest of the gun. All right, so let's talk about this component first. There's a slot in the top, which over time, because it's so thin on the edges, can actually wear out. That is not a drama at all. That's just, you know, how this part is designed. It is aluminium, and it can, and when you're feeling your one, you're going to feel that that's a very, very sharp edge. You know, the thinner the edge, the more susceptible it is to get damaged. If you see this widening, it's not really a big deal. What is a big deal is if that burr goes down inside, because that will then ride on your magazine tube and cause you issues. So when you get this component off, you can run your finger up inside and make sure the inside is smooth. If it's not, you know, take the burr off with a very small diamond file or a needle file, and you can just run that down in there and just clear that burr off. That's all we're really worried about, is making sure the burr is not riding the magazine tube. And that's about it when it comes to this component. All right, with our action bar / bolt carrier, just give it a once over look. You're looking for burrs, areas where it's been riding in the receiver. So these two parts here actually ride on a set of rails inside the receiver. If this gets a burr on it or it gets super dirty, you can actually damage the receiver rails, because the receiver's made of aluminium and this is made of steel. So if you don't clean the gun, you can actually run the gun to death. And by that I mean, if those rails get to a certain amount of damage, the gun will have to get written off, because there is no way of repairing those internal rails. The whole receiver is therefore deemed to be not serviceable and needs to get destroyed. So very important, make sure you've got no burrs or nicks or anything up in here. Now this surface here is what rides on your hammer to cock it. Just same thing, make sure there's no burrs or anything up in there. Charging handle, there's not really anything you can really inspect on the charging handle. Once again, just make sure there's no burrs on it. If there's not, it's all good. Okay, on our bolt, this is the locking lug that we were talking about. So slightly different design from that other bolt that I showed you as the example. But you can see here that is our locking surface. So you need to make sure that that surface is clean and it's not deformed in any way. It's all held together with a series of pins. So we have pins here and here. Now these pins should be pressed in and actually staked. So if we can get the camera to focus, you can see on this one here, there is stake marks, one there and one there. And they are designed to just slightly pin over that edge of that hole and not allow the pin to back itself back out. If you do disassemble your bolt, which I recommend that you as the firearm owner do not do, if you do disassemble it and you don't restake it when you put those pins back in, the pins can actually walk up and then they can catch on the upper surface of the receiver and cause you internal damages, which you really, really don't want. If you're having issues with extraction, sometimes it's because that spring can go. So it's going to be hard for me to quantify this because you're not actually touching this gun, but there is a fair amount of resistance needed to push that up. If it's super soft, that spring may have compressed too much over time and therefore it's no longer serviceable and that spring needs to be replaced. It's an easy replacement part, depending on the spring. It may happen between 1,000 shells and 5,000 shells. It's hard to say because every spring is slightly different, but just understand that that is a serviceable item. It will need to get replaced at some point. Your firing pin spring doesn't really do much because all it's really doing is holding the firing pin back so that when the bolt closes, you can't have inertia push the firing pin forward and slam fire the gun. So it's just there as a safety mechanism to hold the firing pin rearwards. This is very, very rare cases, but sometimes the firing pin can get chipped, and if it gets chipped and it's too sharp, it can actually pierce primers. You'll 100% know if you're piercing primers in your gun because you'll have a lot of gas coming back at you in the face, and then you'll be able to look at those spent cases and see that the primers have been pierced. If you're having that issue though, double check your firing pin and that may be the issue. Now when it comes to our recoil spring or return spring, whichever way you want to talk about it, there is a certain distance that needs to be. So get our little measuring tape here. It should be roughly 290 mil, and you can see that this one here is 292 mil. That is a brand new spring. Now over time these springs will compress because the more they get used and the more they go in and out like this, the more they're going to wear. Springs are not designed to last forever. They do have a service life. Now the service life on these springs is dictated by the overall length, not really by the round count, because it depends. If you're only firing soft shells, it will last you longer. If you're firing heavy recoiling shells, like you're always shooting buckshot or you're always shooting slugs, it will degrade faster. So it's not really a cycle amount of cycles or round count, it's actually the overall length we're going for. So if you measure your recoil spring and it comes in at under 260, which is 2 coils shorter than it should be, that's when you need to have that replaced, because you're going to have a lot of issues with the gun cycling. You may have ejection issues, you may have extraction issues. A lot of things are dictated by this one spring, so that's very important to be checking. So if it's anything above 260, that spring is fine. If it's below 260, that spring needs to get replaced, and that's easy. One can just get sent out to you and you can just whack it straight into your gun. That's it on these components. I'm gonna move this off to the side and we'll move on to the next step. All right, so this next step is only really on Veloces, which I think is a very good thing. A lot of other shotguns don't allow you to do this. Just pulling apart your magazine. On a lot of other shotguns, the magazine is a sealed unit, whereas this end here doesn't really have a plastic cap like this, and it's been rolled over so that you can't actually take the components out of the magazine without breaking the Loctite and pulling the whole tube off the receiver, which I don't recommend you do. That's more of an armourer's job. As you're probably aware from looking at yours, we have these opposing little buttons. All right, so this is all plastic, so don't push too hard on these because you will break it. But what you need to do is place it down, and it's going to be hard for me to show you. All right, so pushing down on the buttons, now you will have to push one side and then go to the other and push the other side. Eventually you can wiggle it and it will come out. Make sure you're releasing under tension. All right, so this is what we're looking at. So we can see that these are just plastic wings with little detents on them. Now if you push them too hard that way to flex them, you can snap them, so be very, very careful when you take that out. If you're not confident in your ability doing it, just don't do it, because as I said, on other shotguns that's not really a thing you can clean yourself anyway. But if you are feeling confident and you feel like you can do that without breaking it, by all means feel free. So we can take out our spring and our follower should come with it. So with this, pretty easy. Just clean it all, make sure it's nice and shiny again and there's no crap on it. And then we can actually run a 12 gauge ball brush up in here, just to pull out any of that crud. Now you will get a lot of crud up in there and that can cause you issues with feeding. If you feel like your magazine's got a real grinding sound, or it looks like your shells are coming back at a very low velocity, then you know that's probably something you need to clean. So we can just whack this one back in here, push it all the way back, guiding the spring, push our end cap back in, make sure they line up, and then it will lock. All right, moving forwards now to the trigger mechanism, and this is where things can get a little interesting. So in the kit with your gun, you're going to have this square drive maintenance pin. This is needed to replace the lever, because if you pull the lever straight out without putting this in to replace it, there is some spring-loaded components within the trigger mechanism which will unseat themselves and you will not be able to get the gun back together and you'll have to send it back to get fixed. So pay attention to this very, very closely. Now on the opposite side of the gun, that is retained by a very, very fine headed screw. I have a very old British turn screw for shotguns, and this fits that slot very, very well, and you can see how fine that tip is. If you have anything like a normal screwdriver, let's say for instance like a normal hardware screwdriver, the tips on those are not the same. This one is a lot thicker, so you will need to grind one down. All right, so this is a hardware screwdriver that's been ground down that way to be thin enough to make it into the slot. So you can do that. It would have been nice if, you know, Verney had have added, you know, the correct screwdriver in the kit. However, I do believe that they weren't really intending for the operators to pull this apart. I think in their minds, being, you know, Europeans, that it was more like an armourer's job, because they have, you know, Europeans are much more on top of sending their guns into an armour or a gunsmith to get them serviced. Whereas in Australia, everyone likes to do everything themselves. So you're going to have to make yourself a little screwdriver for that. But anyway, if you've got that screwdriver, very carefully take this screw out. Now I'm going to flip this gun around. All right, so you can see the square drive of this component. What we need to do is place this in the same orientation, so it's not opposite, it's the exact same orientation as that one, and stick it on top and then push it through to replace it. So to do that, you know, I've got a gunsmith block. You can buy these for like $20 off any old, you know, gun shop, or you can just get a piece of wood. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to stick that underneath just to give it some standoff at the back here. Right, what I'm going to do is get a very small hammer. Right, these hammers are like $8 from Bunnings and they're fantastic for this sort of stuff. So place our maintenance pin over the top, and sometimes you can just push by hand. Sometimes you're going to need the hammer, so that last little part there. And be careful, don't smack your receiver because you'll damage the finish. All right, so we're at a point where both our lever and our pin are in the trigger mech. We want that through a little bit further, so I'm going to need a punch. All right, so at this point, use a hammer, give it a couple of light taps, and push through enough that through the hole you can see where the receiver ends. It needs to be in between the receiver walls, and we can take that lever straight out. So looking through that hole, is the pin centered? Just keep pushing it slightly until it is. All right, that looks pretty centered to me. So now we can move on to the next step. And the next step is we need to punch this pin out. So using our punch again, very lightly, give it a tap. Now sometimes you can just push those out without the hammer. And there's our pin. Remove that. Now always make sure that your safety catch is on, because if you accidentally drop the hammer without the bolt in place, you can damage your trigger mech, so make sure it's always unsafe when you do this. We can give it a wiggle and a pull, and our trigger mechanism is going to come out. With our receiver, we can get up inside now and we can clean. Don't bother taking the shell latch out. It is a roll pin holding it in, and you can physically take it out. That's more of an armourer's job. If you really want to take it out to clean anything, you can. I would advise you not to. If you don't have the correct roll pin punches, you can damage the roll pin, and that's not going to go back together correctly. So I would say just steer clear of that unless you know what you're doing. Now we can get up in here with a rag or a cloth or, you know, spray can, whatever your preferred cleaning method is, and get up inside and clean the inside of the receiver, making sure that you clean the rails that the action bar rides on. As I said earlier, you can catastrophically damage a gun by having either the rails in here dirty or the rails on the action bar dirty. So clean all that, and then you're good to go. All right, with your trigger mechanism, you can see this has got a light bit of oil, and that's just the oil that they put in on assembly at the factory. You don't really need to go and over lubricate your trigger mechanism, being that the whole housing is a polymer. And polymer, when it's riding on metal, is self-lubricating, so you don't really need to lubricate the parts. If you did want to put some oil in there, this is the method I would advise you to do. You can use a spray can, or you can use, you know, a little dropper. So let's just say we did want to oil this. I might go, you know, some oil in there. So that there is too early, and that is going to, you know, introduce dirt and grime into your trigger mech, which is very bad for it. So we want to get rid of 99% of that. All right, and all that excess has now been blown off. That's about the amount of lubrication you need on trigger mech. As I said, you don't really need to lubricate it at all, so I advise you just to, you know, be sparing with it. Things that can get damaged in the trigger mech that would cause you dramas is this pin here is barbell shaped, and it's underneath the hammer here. That can over time bend, and then eventually this shell latch will appear to be hanging too far out of the gun, and it will look like this is bent. It's not actually the latch, it's the pin. That is a service item that gets replaced a lot of the time. So if you are starting to have dramas with your shell latch, that pin needs to be replaced. That's an armourer's job though, so I would leave that not done by you. But yeah, if you are having dramas, that's probably the pin that's causing you the issues. All right, so that's cleaning and maintenance on the Veloce. Let's now put it all back together. Making sure you align that up the correct orientation. That pin will just drop out the bottom. This screw is very fine thread, so don't over torque it. You may use a very small amount of Loctite. Don't use blue. If you are going to use anything, use 222, which is a thread anti-vibration locker. You don't really need to do anything. Just be careful when you tighten this back up, you don't wreck the screw head. Just a little nip till it's tight, and that's all you need. If you go to over tighten it, you'll stretch the fastener. If you stretch the fastener, it will then continuously back out, and that's when you'll need to go and put Loctite into it. So don't over tighten that. It seems counterintuitive to most people's brains. They want to go, oh, I need that to be really tight so it doesn't come out. If you over tighten it, it will become loose. So just don't do that. Now when we're going to put this back together, I'm not going to lubricate this because this gun's going back on the sales shelf. If you were going to lubricate this, you can lubricate your action bars with either oil or lithium grease. Either are good. My personal preference is grease. I find it lasts a bit longer and it's just generally better. But you can use oil, that's all well and good. So just make sure your parts are lubricated before you put them back together. So there you have it, guys. That's cleaning and maintenance on the Verney Carron Veloce. Just remember that there are serviceable parts in here. Some of these parts, particularly the springs, are not designed to last forever. You know, so after a period of time, they will need to get replaced. So if your gun has got plus of, let's say, 2,000 to 3,000 shells, you should probably start looking at replacing some of your parts. If you're running higher pressure or higher recoiling shells, some of those parts will degrade a lot quicker. Thanks for watching, and if you've got any questions, put it in the comments box below.